Yeah, there's some questions here, and someone's written down quite a long question, which covers quite a few different points, which I think could have come up in separate questions. So I'm going to work through some of those first, and if other panelists want to chip in on them, then they're very welcome to. So one of the questions was, and I don't know if I'm reading this all perfectly outright, because the handwriting, but I'll try and do my best. A lot of the light is about the supposed takeover by the digital world, 1984, the New World Order, Great Reset, cashless society. What do you think? So there's quite a few different things to talk about there. So I'll try and talk about each of them and offer a kind of general answer as well. So the first thing to say is that I didn't mention those things in my talk because I wanted to talk about the things that concern us in the paper, and not the stuff that's kind of less concerning. Emma, in her opening, talked about how not everything in the paper is appalling, and that there's an article that seems quite good on the Rwandan genocide. And a lot of the content in the paper on the digital world is kind of falls into that category to some extent. Yeah, so the first thing to say about all the stuff with the digital world is I think we should all be really concerned about a lot of the things that are happening in the digital world in terms of what has been called surveillance capitalism. You know, stuff where your data is constantly getting harvested off everything you do or say on your phone. The fact that you're carrying it around with you and leaving the kind of data of where you've been and gone and maybe your payments and all that stuff. I think we all should be really concerned about that stuff. Naomi Klein, in her book, and in the interviews about her book, Doppelgang, talks about how the cosmic right or conspiritualists, or whatever we want to talk about this, however we want to describe Crystal Fash, how we want to describe this movement, often, in her words, get the feelings right but the facts wrong. And I'm not sure actually how much I go along completely with that phrase, but it's quite a good short one to get across this idea that people are experiencing something unsettling, and they can tell that something's wrong in the world and they want to do something about it, but they might not necessarily get a totally accurate read of what that is. And it's very hard in the case of the digital stuff because a lot of it's opaque and it's very confusing to us. We don't have the expertise to understand this stuff that's being collected, and the tools that we have are very convenient to use and have been so widely applied that we all attempted to exchange convenience for invasion on our privacy. For instance, I've got my phone here today. It's been very handy for making arrangements to get here, make notes, all the rest of it. But at the same time, I'm kind of horrifyingly aware that I've left this data trail. I liked it when I didn't do that, when I just lived in a pre-phone world, and I feel very grateful that as a kind of nearly 40-year-old person, I had that experience of a pre-smartphone world that lots of people these days don't. But that said, I do think that sometimes those articles are being used to recruit people into ideas that aren't brilliant. There's various bits of content in the paper I would say is better. I think it is there not to persuade people of those better ideas, but to make the bad ideas look better, to pull people in. That's its function. And I think also some of those articles, even on the stuff where the broad topic is kind of agreeable to me, are engaged in misdirection about what we should do about it. And the example I give in terms of the digital stuff particularly is that a lot of the tenor of the writing on that topic is very anti-Chinese, which is not to say that there aren't reasons to be concerned about the way the Chinese state uses some of this technology. But it's like total misdirection to imply that only the Chinese state is doing this stuff and that we should be more concerned about Facebook, Elon Musk's X, which actually sometimes gets praised in the paper because it's supposedly about free speech. He's still collecting all that data and doing dodgy things with it. Yes, I think it's a massive problem, but there are ways in which the paper can misdirect people's concern about that stuff. One thing that I also think is handled well in Naomi Klein's book. So one example of this getting the feelings right but the facts wrong would be that a lot of the stuff about vaccination, about COVID vaccines, and at this point I should say that I have no bother really about whether people choose to be vaccinated for COVID-19 or not. I think that mandates are a terrible idea. Forcing people to do that is a bad idea. But one of the things that came up was people were saying that they thought there were microchips in them that were going to track them and stuff. And some of the people on broadly defined our side mocked that and said things like haven't they heard of phones? You know, you're already being tracked wherever you go. And Naomi Klein, I think, writes really well about how that's a totally inappropriate reaction, that of course people know about phones, and that's where that anxiety comes from, and we should be attentive to that anxiety and not just mock it and treat people as being silly. There are, of course, hilarious examples of this. I think she also talks about, I think it's Naomi Wolf, overhearing some conversation between Apple employees talking about time machine, or like this function that you have on Apple computers to get back to your how your computer was a period of time ago. And Naomi Wolf interprets this as the vaccines were going to enable them to go back and do well. And it is funny, but yes, I think she writes well about that. And the last thing to say about, and this applies to more than just the digital, the stuff that's better in the paper, I've said to the people distributing it in our town, if your main concern is digital surveillance or medical freedom or freedom from authoritarianism generally, don't you think you'd be able to convince more people if you dropped all the really controversial stuff or the hate speech? Why do you think that is helpful to have that in the paper? Can't you see that when it puts me off, it also puts a whole bunch of other people off? And I find that their bad answers to that question are very revealing about whether their genuine concern is about these things or whether their real concern is a quite different set of ideas. So just to bring that whole answer back to why I have a bit of an issue with Naomi Klein's thing about how they get the feelings right but the facts wrong. For some people, I think the feelings that motivate it all are the dodgy, racialised conspiracies where Jews are controlling everything. And then they add on this layer of, oh, I'm concerned about digital surveillance, blah, blah, blah. But actually, really what they care about is this racialised other that they think is controlling everything. Obviously, it's very hard to strip that stuff out. But yeah, those are some thoughts. Also mentioned in that was 1984. I'm not going to talk about 1984 lots, although on the car on the way down I was talking with one of my friends from Stroud about how I wrote an essay on that as a teenager at school. Great book, raises lots of concerning issues. One of the things that I find with some of the people who raised 1984 in the way that it's raised in like The Light and stuff is that those people don't seem to have read some of George Orwell's other work. Particularly Homage to Catalonia. If you want to know what George Orwell thinks about fascism, read Homage to Catalonia. It's also a great book to read in terms of how anti-fascist movements, the divides between them. It's great, for example, I think he's great on the Stalinist role in losing the Spanish Civil War to the fascists. So yeah, just a book recommendation. The Great Reset. This is harder. I'm not an expert on this. Clearly, there is some stuff being written by people in the World Economic Forum that I'm not particularly a fan of. The World Economic Forum is one example of an organisation of the ruling class. But I think one of the things that's troubling about The Light, or the way that some people report on this, is it's not the only one. And I find it very confusing that when I was growing up and there was an anti-globalisation movement, there was a lot of focus on the World Trade Organisation, the World Bank, the IMF, lots of other international capitalist institutions. And The Light and lots of others of these organisations tend to ignore all of those because they don't fit with this idea of libertarian capitalism that they're kind of trying to push in the paper. Whereas the World Economic Forum, they can make that the big bad. Sometimes they make the UN the big bad, and the Sustainable Development Goals are like the worst possible thing that any transnational organisation has ever come up with. And it's very confusing if you've been a part of those movements that were opposed to things that the World Trade Organization were doing, which frankly I think were obviously much worse, stripping away people's rights, stripping away environmental protections, that kind of thing. And that's not to say that the Great Reset doesn't fit in with that stuff and it's kind of separate, but it's just why aren't we talking about the other bits? And then cashless, again, sorry, this is a long answer, but I'm just trying to be as brief as I can on all these different aspects. Cashless, again, it's quite simple to say I think people should be able to use cash. It's great that that's happening today. I think it's great when people can use both, because there is added convenience to card payments sometimes. And just to be super idealistic, I think it is fundamentally a small c conservative thing to just want to preserve cash. I kind of prefer a utopian vision where we weren't deciding things based on the money we had and didn't have so much of a focus on it. I think if you want to be really have a kind of progressive alternative view of things, you wouldn't just want to preserve the system that we had in the 50s. It's another example of that. The person I'd suggest that people read on cashless is a guy called Brett Scott. He's got a great article online called Going Cashless, where he talks about his opposition to cashlessness, but also about his issues with the kind of conspiracy theories around it. Just saying basically, yeah, there are moves to do this, but we're not as doomed as people might think. It's bad to tell people that we are, because that's disempowering. So he's really good. He's also got an article called War on Informality, which talks more about the digital side of things. So yeah, that was a long answer to that question, so I'll shut up for a bit. Maybe that. Did either of you want to say anything about it?
No, that's very comprehensive.
Right, are we going here? Okay. So there's a comment here on the Great Replacement Theory, about white people being 13 to 18% of the population worldwide. So we can't possibly catch up. Therefore, how can we be replaced? Okay, I've got some comments. I don't know exactly the percentage of white people versus black and people of colour on a worldwide basis. But I do want to say, let's go back 300 years. Let's go back to the end of the 17th century when colonisation began. White people actually formed only a very, very small part of the people in northwestern Europe. Everybody else was black or brown. And it was through colonisation and through going to places like America, North America, South America, and going to Australia in particular, where white people also seemed to breed like rabbits, and overtook those populations, also because they committed genocide against the brown people of those territories. And so that's something really to think about. If you think about people being worried about the Great Replacement, what has happened in history is something which is quite the reverse. The other point to say about that is that somebody said also white people descended from brown people, and I suppose that if you go back millions of years, you could say that that is actually true. But I think that neither of that has a real bearing on this paranoid theory about white nations being taken over by brown people. Particularly, this actually came from the United States, where if you think that the original indigenous population are brown skinned, and then there was the importation of millions of people of African descent to work as enslaved people in the cotton and tobacco plantations. So they formed also a huge percentage of the population. And so that the white population there, the issue is about how they maintain control over black and brown people. And it is true that with immigration, etc., excuse me, that the percentage of non-white people has increased to about 60% of, no, it's the other way around, sorry. The white people have decreased from 60% to 40% of the population there. So that is what the white power structures are very worried about. And so hence all this kind of move to try and reverse that. Really, the whole thing is ridiculous. Because why should it even matter? You know, human beings are human beings. Human beings are active in the economy, they're doing things, making things, designing things, creating things. That's really all that matters. You know, we're creating societies in which anybody can live in harmony with everybody else. So I don't think they've got a particularly strong argument. And I think that in terms of Britain, You know, our non-white population is remaining around about 13%. It is not a threat to white majority British people. It really is not a threat. And we should be welcoming that diversity. That's my point of view.
Just wanted to add to that also, I do wonder if people who decry feminism and people who believe in this sort of great replacement theory ideas might be worried about it because they see what they've done to the people of those colours and the people that are not male and how those people have been treated, and they don't want it for themselves. So I think in a way it's a reflection of the attitude of those people themselves as to how they must subconsciously recognise. I mean, there is in the current issue of the paper a whole section there saying that we should not say that we were responsible for slavery. We should not say that we did that. We shouldn't be taking any responsibility for that. And that type of sort of rhetoric is in the current issue. And I think that whole article, it didn't really have anything very much to say, apart from basically we're all a bit racist in here. But I think really we have to recognise that actually one of the very reasons why this is the case is because they like their white privilege and they don't want it taken away. And people that didn't have privilege wouldn't worry about it, would they really? Because they wouldn't have anything to lose.
I just want to then just put the question back to you, whether there were any questions that anybody had about the issues around the new far right and its position on women and our reproductive health rights.
Just before that, while people are thinking of those, can I just add a few bits on great replacement? So, stepping up, your talk was brilliant, but one thing, when you talked about what the great replacement theory was, and you said it's racist and it contains this patriarchal stuff, one thing that I think is worth emphasising is it's a very anti-Semitic theory. People might remember that at the kind of height of stuff talking about Trump on the far right, there was this march in Charlottesville with the people with the torches. People remember that? And the chant that those people were making was, Jews will not replace us. And the chant is not saying that Jews will be the ones who do the great replacing, like individual Jewish people outnumbering white people. The conspiracy theory is that Jews have this conspiracy to replace white people with Muslims, black, brown people. So, as Stephanie was saying, it ties together all this stuff, because it is so much about reproductive rights, and as Stephanie said, it's really about, we need to get white women breeding, and we need them to be stuck in their homes looking after the kids. And it's about the anti-Semitism, and it's about this fundamentally racist idea that it would be a problem if there were more black people. It is a kind of combination of everything terrible that they're trying to say. But I just want to say two little things about it. So this thing about white people are about 13 to 18% worldwide. I'm sure the stat is roughly accurate. And that's why sometimes people use, instead of language that used to be used in my lifetime, the third world or the developing world or the underdeveloped world, people tend now to talk about the global majority. I think that's partly a useful phrase. And one reason it's useful is because there's still structurally racist stuff going on about that global majority. It's the majority of people, and yet most of them, not all of them, because you still have class divides within those countries, are disenfranchised, if not in poverty, ignored in almost all the conversations that take place in mainstream media and in our societies. They're going to mostly be the victims of climate change, all this stuff, right? And like you're saying, it's a kind of projection or pushing away, further projection or pushing away to say what we should really be worried about is what's happening to us here in our place, where we might get some more people moving here or whatever. Those are the bits that I want to add on that one. And now we've got one other question to get to, but yeah, let's have some more on
Thank you. Okay, so I really want to stress and emphasise that we cannot minimalise the threat that the far right have on us as well. We are 50% or just more, 54% of the population. So what affects us is absolutely massive. We are not a minority group. We are actually over half the population. So what happens to us is really, really important. And this is also about our daughters. I showed you the slide that said, I can't believe I'm still having to protest this shit. And this is about our daughters and what they are going to have to perhaps experience if we go down the road of limiting access to free birth control and free access to abortion when we feel it is necessary for us. But it's also more than that, because it is our rights around every single aspect of our life. And the thing about the right, who says that they control what goes on in here, in me? This control over our bodies, this is a deeply, deeply personal thing for each and every woman. This is our body space that they try to control. So this is a massive issue, and I would please urge any of you, all of you, to be really, really vigilant about this, because it will come through and creep through very, very slowly. And for example, in America, one of the things that they did was take funding from birth control out of your health insurance paid by employers. So once women can't afford to pay for it, then you're going to get, problems. And it is just such a really crucial and critical thing. So again, I would ask if any of you have any questions, anything you wanted to say. Maria.
There's a profound irony in that, really, isn't there? Because at the same time that they are obsessing about interfering with your figures, they are obsessing about other people surveilling them and interfering with them. Yes.
Yeah, just quickly on that, there's this massive emphasis on bodily autonomy, medical autonomy they refer to, right? About not being vaccinated if you don't want to be. And yeah, fair enough. But then what about bodily autonomy around reproductive rights? What about bodily autonomy around trans rights? I don't know how, there's lots of things in the paper that seem so internally contradictory like that. But yeah. The core question, I said this in a talk at a rally we did about the Katie Hopkins thing, is like, who did this really well? IBM, and you talked about this really well in your introduction. It's like their emphasis on freedom, and it's freedom for who? And freedom to do what? Because you don't seem very interested in the freedom of children to cycle to school safely, because you're more interested in the freedom of people to drive at whatever speeds they want to. Like, there's no understanding that there might be some conflicting freedoms, and that you have to decide which people are more interested in having freedom, or how you can manage those conflicts to get the best for everyone.
Maybe that's fine, I'll just leave you on.
Yeah, I know, we do need to sort of move on. Is it very quick?
It's a question.
Let's go to a question. We'll see if we can do
Absolutely,
it.
that's fine. So we've got about 2 minutes. Go on then, switch your
I've only just turned up, I've been here half an hour, so I haven't heard the rest of the talk. But my contention is, if you object to the newspaper and you don't like the newspaper, why don't you just not read the newspaper?
So I'll answer that one really quickly, because I answered it at length in my talk earlier, so talk to someone who saw that and you can do it. But basically, the short answer is, yeah, well, we tried that and it didn't go away and the problems got worse. And the problems in our case include people organising a meeting that celebrated Hitler's birthday and talked about anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. So, like, it can be really bad, like not something we can just ignore. That this is a major social phenomenon that we're just interested in anyway. And that, we can't just be unconcerned about things when they impact us as individuals directly. So a lot of the people in this room have some kind of identity that's been attacked in the paper. And if it really cares about freedom and people getting the best for themselves, then it should try to make sure we can all live like that. None of us here have talked about banning it. We're trying to prevent it being given out. We just want to use our freedom of speech to kind of put our view across.
Because that's what Hitler did, he burned books and stuff.
Exactly, we've done a whole bit about that, so we've just talked about which books he burned and all that. So.
We talked about that.
I mean, we talked it. And, yeah.
It's in video, you'll have to wait till it comes out on YouTube.
When the video comes out,
Could you summarise just in a
No.
I mean, I'm just going to say one thing. The books that the Nazis burned and the books that are being banned in Florida now are not things like The Light that are putting out far-right propaganda. They are books that talked about people's diverse experiences of gender identity. They are books that talk about the history of racism. Those are the books that got burned. Those are the books that are getting banned in Florida. No one, the government isn't threatening to ban The Light because it's putting out stuff that broadly goes along with its agenda, actually. So, yeah. There was one other question which I want to try and do a really quick answer. I know we're really tight for time. Yeah, so that was about the left and right and horseshoe theory. So the quick answer I'm going to give on that is I'm not very keen on horseshoe theory. I don't think it's just about the centre being okay and there being these extremes either side. Naomi Klein in her book talks a bit about this concept of diagonalism, which again I'm also not very keen on, but if we look at diagonalism very briefly is about how there's this kind of connection which Stephanie talked about quite a lot about kind of supposedly libertarian ideas, but then also the authoritarianism of fascism and how there's this movement that somehow combines them. The thing that I think we need to look at in terms of that stuff is historic fascism and its roots and how it was often from disaffected people on the left who were brought into it. So Mussolini famously was involved in trade unions. Lots of the people in the early Italian fascist movement were anarcho-syndicalists or anarchists. Mosley, who set up the British Union of Fascists, the fascist movement in Britain, had been a Labour MP. We need to be attentive to the complexity of politics. One thing that the Light kind of get wrong, but also it has a germ of truth in it, is this idea that the left and right aren't useful labels anymore. And to an extent that is true. They are very simplifying labels. They miss a lot. They do contain a lot as well. But if we're really going to talk about this stuff, you need to study the history of how these labels have been used and where they get to. The one recommendation I'm going to make on that stuff is actually a kind of comedy podcast called Seriously Wrong. I can't remember what the title of the one they do on the political compass is, but their episode on the political compass and how it's all a lot more complicated than just a horseshoe is really great. So, yeah.